Well, I'm Amanda Glassman. I'm the Executive Vice President and Senior Fellow here at the Center for Global Development. Welcome to the virtual CGD. Today, we really have the great privilege to host Professor Michael Kremer, co-recipient of the 2019 Nobel Prize in Economics. USAID's Development Innovation Ventures, or DIV, was set up in 2010 to identify and test new solutions to development problems and to help scale those that prove successful. But of course, when you try new and untested approaches, not every investment has an impact. Indeed, most can fail, but some can save millions of lives or generate massive welfare gains. So taken together, even if some fail, the development returns on a set of investments or a portfolio of investments is what matters and what tells us if DIV is worth it from a development perspective. And Michael and his colleagues and co-authors, some of whom are on this call as well, have developed an approach to assess the social rate of return of that portfolio that DIV has invested in over the past years. So today we'll talk about this work and its implications for how governments and social investors, including USAID, might double down on their focus on investing in innovation and evidence. I would say DIV so far has been small in scale. The program's budget reaches only $23 million annually, or 0.1% of the $20 billion state foreign ops budget. And we have limited rigorous information on the impact of that broader spending. So should we be rethinking the balance in this overall aid portfolio? Should we look to see more DIV or more DIV type approaches in the future? We'll turn it over to Michael to discuss. And Michael's presentation will be recorded and posted, but we will then turn off the recording for discussion and questions and answers. So thanks so much for joining us this morning, and over to you, Michael.
Great, thank you so much. First wanted to acknowledge my co-authors, Sasha Gallant at CRI, Olga Rostopchova, also at the University of Chicago, and Milind Thomas from the Asian Development Bank. And I should also thank Esther Duflo, who, because what I'll be presenting today draws on a paper we wrote together in 2015 on which innovations scale. I also wanted to say that while I'll be speaking as an academic today, I've been involved with DIV. I'm scientific director, helped co-found the program, and in fact, Sasha, Olga, and Milind also have links there. So I wanted to disclose that. This is an updated version of a presentation that some people may have seen before. And basically it's updated because we have an additional year of data on both. Some programs have now reached more people. We also have additional evidence on impact, and particularly wanted to acknowledge Milind Thomas for leading this update. This is still work in progress. We still haven't finalized everything, but I think there are very interesting findings in the update. So something for those of you who've seen some of the earlier work. So I think this will be a paper, we'll draw our data from the Development Innovation Ventures paper at USAID, but I think this addresses a much broader set of questions. There's many recent initiatives in recent decades to promote innovation and international development, and those take a number of forms. Some of them are to promote scientific research and development. For example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has invested a huge amount in developing new vaccines, new medical technology to address the problems of the developing world. There's a number of Grand Challenges program. BMGF has one. Grand Challenges Canada. Other donors are involved in that. There's agricultural technology that CGIAR has invested in. So that's one category. Another is social science research. So World Bank, through its has invested in this through the Gender Innovation Lab, through a number of programs. Often, some of them financed by trust funds with support from the UK and others. And then a third strand of investing in innovation is the impact investing or social entrepreneurship movement. And some arcade brands there, Omidyar Network would be one, Skoll Foundation, many others. so these are widespread movements, and I think they've attracted a lot of excitement, but they've also attracted some questioning. Do these programs really scale? What's the real impact? And while there's strong theoretical reasons for thinking this type of investment might be fruitful, there are many pressing immediate needs in development, and there's a very important question of where should we be allocating funds? So I won't take on quite the challenge that Amanda posed, but I would like to look at two questions based on data from the Innovation Fund. First, is the innovation is investing in innovation a good investment? What's the return to this compared to the normal return that one gets in investments? And then the second one is, if it is a good investment, then we want to think about how can we do a better job, and then part of that is thinking which innovations scale, because scaling it's not sufficient for an investment being good, but it's probably a necessary condition for achieving substantial returns. And I'll maybe add a third question, which is how should we operate these types of investments in innovation and international development? There's a lot of people think we should try to be more like the private commercial investors and adopt certain methods that they use. Another approach would be to say, well, let's recognize that the commercial investors are out there and let's look for complementary approaches. This may shed some light on that, although that'll be more speculative. Okay. So on the first question, does the return on innovation investment exceed the return from other investments? There's anecdotes of success, some things, and I can share some of those, but there's also anecdotes of failure. Things like, a classic one is the play pump, a water device that was, sold as the best thing since sliced bread, and really was a pretty spectacular failure. Those anecdotes will only get you so far because you can come up with anecdotes on both sides. Another approach is to look at counts. How many innovations were invested in, how many succeeded. I'm going to argue that that approach can be pretty misleading. I think we're going to be trying to build on an approach in the economics literature of assessing the returns to scientific R&D that really goes back to Grelica's work in 1958, looking at agricultural investment in the US, development of hybrid corn, et cetera. But this paper will differ a little bit from that literature because what we will be focusing in on innovation for development, and we'll also be examining, if you think about those three categories of investment I began with, there's a lot of work looking at the impact of investment in pure science R&D, but this will be looking at also at social science RCTs, randomized controlled trials, and social entrepreneurship. We'll also, I hope, to advance things a bit methodologically. We'll use a bounding approach, and there's some limits to that approach, but I think they're very useful when they're data limitations, and we'll apply that to the early portfolio of development innovation ventures. But I think this bounding approach could be used more broadly. Okay. So let me give you some background on the particular portfolio. I couldn't agree more with Amanda. You really want to take a portfolio look, not cherry pick a few anecdotes of success or failure, but look at an overall portfolio. So we looked at the portfolio of development innovation ventures. And I should say that while it has a lot in common with other innovation funders, in some ways the structure and the processes of that differed from many other innovation funders, and particularly in the early years. And because it takes time for innovations to scale, often it takes decades for innovations to scale, we've focused on the early portfolio. We're approaching our 10-year anniversary right now, so it seems opportune to look back and say, what was the impact of those early innovations? But let me describe the program just so you have some context. So DIV is in some ways different from a lot of innovation funders, and the funding is very open. It's really an open innovation approach, and that means it's open across sources of innovation, so it funds scientists doing chemistry or biology or IT, but it also funds social entrepreneurs, it funds NGOs, It's very open. Funds, it's even open to applications from international institutions. We're open across sectors. Some innovation funds are focused on health or solar energy. We're open. Similarly, we're open across geographies. And I think very importantly, we're open across scaling approaches. We're open to things that would scale commercially, but we're also open to things that would scale through adoption by developing country governments, for example. We have a pretty broad definition of innovation. It's not just gadgets, it could also be a new approach to operating a government program. So, we're open in a lot of ways. How do you run a program in that? You can't have specialists in every field. And our approach is really tiered funding. So the first stage of funding is piloting. Those not the amounts have changed now, but at the beginning it was up to 100,000 to pilot a new idea. You don't want to do a rigorous test before you piloted something. Second stage was for testing. That could either be a rigorous test for impact and cost effectiveness. You're designed to separate out the causal impact of the program from other confounding factors. Typically, those were randomized controlled trials, but they didn't have to be. Or alternatively, it could be a test of, can you really be sustainable on a commercial basis? Can you cover all your costs? Can you get to can you be viably commercial? The third stage was to transition to scale, and that was for the things that had really been most successful in stage two, either with us or through other funders if they've got to that stage, and to try to move them to scale, because I think there's widespread recognition. Certainly when we started the program, one of the motivators for me was the understanding that it's not enough to have evidence. You need a bunch of additional work to refine the innovation, adapt it, work with the stakeholders, and in order for it to actually scale. As I said, I'm describing the program as it existed originally. If some of you are interested in learning about the current program or perhaps applying for funding, please go to the website that's listed there, and we welcome proposals. I think it's also worth describing a little bit the selection and investment process, which also had something in common with other innovation funders, but also differed in some ways. During this early period, there's a very small staff, and we were just starting out, and we were operating within USAID's procurement rules. And that at that time, now there's been changes in procurement rules. There's more flexibility. We have excellent legal support. But when we're starting out, there was really we were really judging the proposals that came in, and there was not a whole lot of opportunity for co-creation. And I think I'm noting that because there's a debate in the venture capital community. How much should you be just selecting the good things to fund? How much should you be trying to get involved and improve the proposals that come and work with the innovators that you fund? I'd also say that the review process was pretty heavily based on the application that came in. There was also a lot of peer review, partly heavily involving development economics researchers, but also commercial investors. There wasn't, some organizations have decisions made not based on the application, but by an investment memo written by the staff. And there just wasn't, we just didn't have a big enough staff to do that at the time. And the staff were saw themselves more as neutral, not as advocates for applications, for particular applications, but they didn't have skin in the game in that sense. They were sort of neutral, assessing the proposals. We did, we looked at the potential for scale, but that was done in some ways differently than some other organizations. We focused pretty heavily on cost. There's a saying in the venture capital industry that, don't look at the idea, look at the team. And we were actually pretty flexible on team composition. We cared about team composition, but we didn't, we were open to teams that, had, if it was particularly if it's an early stage innovation where we were, stage 2, for example, where it was testing, we were open to somebody who had a track record of testing things well. We weren't necessarily looking for somebody who had a management record. We also, there are programs designed to scale and test and scale public sector programs, or just to test them, evaluation funds. They often say, well, you need a separate implementer and evaluator, and we really need a big distinction between those. And we really were not insisting on that. We were happy to fund the innovation as well, itself, as well as the evaluation. Okay, so that's background. Let me get a little bit more concrete and give you some examples of the type of things that we scaled. I think this will be useful as you think about which ones actually did scale. These are the types of things we funded. So, there's really a pretty diverse set of things. So some things were academic, some things were nonprofit, some things were for-profit. Some things were, if you look at this first one that's highlighted, that was something that was a social entrepreneurship. That was some people from MIT Sloan Business School that had a sanitation model that they were going to try to scale in Kenya. There was some involved some tech. Not ICT tech for this one. This was just a gadget, a device, this hand washing device. Some were like Insight, were selling to companies. Others, like this bicycle tire that was not subject to punctures, was trying to reach ultimate consumers. Some, here's another example of a tech-oriented energy sector one. This fuel cell that was designed for bicycles. There was also things that were more social science. This voter report cards, no real gadget, but a social science innovation. Okay. So those are examples of the types of things we funded. If we're going to look at do the benefits exceed the costs? And let me first think about that for a particular investment. The way we do this for a particular investment is we say, we can think about it for the portfolio as a whole by adding up across the investments. You could say, are the discounted benefits of the innovation investment greater than the cost? That determines was this a good investment. The benefits can be broken down to the number of people reached times the net benefits per person. That's net because you're subtracting off the costs. One thing that I want to emphasize, we try to be conservative in a number of approaches, in a number of ways. But one important one is, a lot of organizations will list all the things they funded that succeeded, but there may have been 10 different funders for something. So we're only going to count the share of benefits that correspond to our share of investment. That helps mean that you could aggregate across the if all investors did this, you could aggregate up to get sector-wide returns. Obviously, you can't, it doesn't get at the counterfactual. Maybe if we hadn't funded something, somebody else would have. Happy to speculate on that, but it's hard to get hard evidence on that. Okay, so it's a hard problem to try to get at the benefits and compare them to the costs. It's hard for a number of reasons. First, there are conceptual issues. Some of these innovations were innovations to reduce electoral fraud, and we saw some quantitative evidence that there were some reductions in fraud. But how do you put a dollar value on it? We don't have any way. So we're actually just going to not count the benefits of those innovations. Not satisfactory, but I'll tell you how you can interpret this in a minute. Other cases, there's just data limitations. Some of the things, not everything required a impact evaluation because some things, if we thought it could scale commercially, there's no need for that. We didn't feel there was a need for it. So we don't have credible impact assessments for everything. Or in other cases, the idea of DIV and the idea of, I think of innovation, people who study innovation realize it's a process. It's not a one step. Things need to be adapted and changed and modified for particular uses. In some cases, the scaled version of the innovation differed so much from the original that it was just very hard to, where we had an evaluation that was hard to apply those the results of the initial evaluation to the scaled program. And finally, innovations often take time to scale. We don't know the future benefits. So how do we deal with this? Well, we are going to take advantage. We're looking at our first 2.5 years. There's 43 awards to 41 innovations. We're just going to look at a subset of them. So as I'll show you in a minute, there's a very skewed distribution of which innovations scale, consistent with what Amanda was just saying. And that means we're just going to look at a subset of the high-scale innovations. Not all of those can we get data on impact in a way that we can quantify. So we're going to look at the benefit of a subset of innovations that reached high scale and where we happen to be able to get to the data. And we'll compare the benefits of that subset to the cost of the full portfolio. And then we're going to use a bunch of other conservative assumptions, which I'm happy to discuss afterwards. But so we're not going to be able to give you an estimate of the benefit cost ratio. But what we can do is say, because this is the benefits of a subset weighed against the cost of the whole portfolio, we'll be able to tell you that it's reasonable to think that the benefits are at least as much as that ratio. Sorry, the benefit cost ratio is at least as high as the ratio of benefits of a subset to the cost of the full portfolio. I'll try to be more concrete in a minute. Okay, here's a picture that shows the extent of the number of people reached as of May 2020. So this is extended by some time from the previous, a little bit more than a year from the previous analysis, of different innovations. And one thing to note is this is a very skewed shape. There's a lot of innovations that don't reach that many people, and then a few that account for the great majority of people reached. And this chart doesn't really feel, if you look at the little symbol over on the vertical axis, there's not enough room to put the largest scaling innovation on the chart because it's off the chart. So we had to modify the chart. This is really very concentrated. And I think that's a general lesson when you look at innovation. It's not a bell curve shape of success. Rather, it's this very skewed tail of innovations. Overall, 9 of the 43 innovations reached more than 1 million people. I think that's we haven't tried to do a formal comparison with other funders. I think this is a pretty good rate overall there's a USAID has an effort called the Million Lives Club, which is trying to collect data. It's not complete. They're still compiling things, but they currently list 33 innovations that have scaled to more than 1 million people out of more than 2,000 innovations supported by a wide set of funders, internationally. And so that's sort of less than it's not really an apples to apples comparison because they're still working on their list, but this is a very high scaling rate relative to that. Okay, so what's the approach? Well, among these 9 that scaled to more than 1 million, we looked for which ones could we quantify the benefits for? And those are the ones in red. So let me go through, and I won't go through the full analysis or anything like it, but I'll just try to give you a flavor of those. So the first one that reached the most people was software for community health workers. This was a private firm. It sold to, Government of India, the Gates Foundation, other public sector buyers or philanthropic buyers. They've reached 60 million people. I think that's going up. That's not the number of community health workers, but the number of community health workers that the number of clients that community health workers serve. And there's evidence here. I put something from a randomized trial on the increased rate of facility delivery, but they also have other outcomes, increased immunizations. Voter report cards. That one, you'll notice an asterisk by, that's in black. We don't compute the benefits from that in the calculation that follows because the form that scaled was substantially different than where we have the evidence. But that seems to reduce vote buying in the original trial. That one scaled by an NGO published. I think one of the lessons of this is there's many routes to scale. It's not just commercial versus government adoption. This is something where an NGO publishes the information on using public information on politicians, and newspapers then print that. So that's why it's reached a lot of people. the glasses that I'm wearing are not from them, but they're unfortunately much more expensive than the glasses they produce. There's an RCT showing, that is one of the ones we use. There's a study that was in a particular context, tea pickers, and they measured a 22% increase in productivity following the distribution of these inexpensive glasses. Of course, we don't know whether that number applies elsewhere, so we're going to be conservative, and we use half that number, 11%, as applying that to the rest of the scaling of that. Okay, I'll speed up a bit. Election monitoring technology, this one's scaled largely by a political party. Road safety stickers, this was scaled in part by private insurance companies, in part by the government of Kenya. Agricultural extension. I should note that some of these I was involved with. I've put a note there to disclose that. Dispensers for safe water. This was scaled by an NGO. Digital attendance monitoring. That actually reached a lot of people in the actual RCT. And the last one, psychometric credit assessment. This was using an approach to give credit scores for people on their digital phones. This one, they didn't give the loans themselves. They sold the technology to banks and other lenders. Okay, I mentioned the glasses. I'm not going to show the full calculation, but let me give one example, at least a rough idea. This DIV made a 430,000 grant. As I say, the evidence suggested a 22% increase in productivity in one context. To be conservative, we'll assume half that. They sold 6.8 million glasses. You can compute the benefits from that. But DIV only funded 5% of the innovation funds that went into this. So we're only going to count 5% of the benefits. That comes out to 31.8 million in net benefits after adjusting for, that's at a 10% discount rate. So again, pretty conservative. Okay, so when you look at the 5 projects that we could quantify, and we'll measure everything in 2010 dollars. The total cost of the portfolio, as Amanda said, it was fairly modest. So the annual budget was smaller than, so that was about $17 million. I can't see it on my screen here. But the benefits of just 5 of the 41 innovations were $281 million. So 17 times as big as the cost of the full portfolio. So very high rate of return. And I think that shows that it is possible to get very high returns in this sector. I will note one other thing, which is, when we did this a year ago, a bit more over a year ago, did the previous version, the number at that stage was just 6-fold, which is still a very impressive return to have 6 times the benefits be at least 6 times the cost. But this, why is it so much bigger? Well, in part because things have scaled a lot more, in part because we have more evidence. But I think one lesson is you really do have to give time to see the impact of this. Okay, I should note, just to reemphasize, we're omitting a bunch of things on the benefit side. We're omitting future benefits. This is just what's already happened. We're omitting 4 of the 9 innovations with the highest reach, where we just couldn't quantify the benefits. We're omitting the benefits of innovations that reach less than 1 million people, and we're omitting a lot of externality benefits. The other thing that we tried to look at is which innovations scale. If we think we can get high returns in this sector, how do we figure out where to invest? There, we need to look at more than just these 5. We needed more data. We can get more data on the scale that was reached. So I'm going to look at that. Scale is obviously not a sufficient condition for it being a good investment. You could scale something that's not helpful, but it is a necessary condition. And I think one of the reasons we looked at scale is there's a lot of concern in the sector, because while a lot of commercial innovations scale, think about cell phones or for example, there's concern over whether, or think about, there are also things that are just developed without social innovation funding, like the used clothing industry, for example. But there's concern over whether these sort of purposeful efforts on social entrepreneurship or impact investing there's at least some people are concerned of how many of those examples scale. And there's a gray literature that examines this, but that gray literature tends to examine the innovations which scaled, and then they say, well, what do those innovations have in common? But of course, it's a subjective analysis. They come up with things like it's very important to know your customer, for example, which I think has got to be true. But the problem is it's very subjective. If they scaled, then you think, okay, they knew their customer. If they didn't scale, you can decide they didn't. So we'd like to find things that could be categorized a bit more objectively at the time of the award and say, well, what predicts scaling? So we thought we would try that with our very limited data set. So one thing to look at, one piece of, I found this really, some of the results were very different than the conventional wisdom in the field. So one piece of conventional wisdom is that pilots never scale, that you really need to launch big. And, if we looked at our stage 1 awards, they actually only had a 17% scaling rate. The stage 2, 25%, stage 3, only one data point there, but it did scale. That is one way of seeing it. That seems consistent with the conventional wisdom. But let me show you something else. If we look at the award value and the people reached, and we just say, well, how many people reached per dollar spent? Well, then you get a very different picture. I don't want to overemphasize these differences. This is a small sample. I don't want to claim these differences are significant. But I would say that there's reason to question the idea that pilots never scale. Why do we have that intuition? I think it's because we see a lot of pilots and a lot of them fail. Only 17% of them succeeded. And I don't think we do the mental calculation in our head to say, well, how about the number of people reached per dollar spent? But if you do that calculation, things look a lot better for the early stage innovation. So I think I wouldn't say let's not do stage 3, but I would say I don't think we should abandon the early stage work. The administrative costs are substantial, and that's not captured here. Okay. I also felt there were a lot of interesting lessons on the rate of scaling by award characteristics. So if you look at the first set of the first things we looked at, the unit cost. Some of these were inexpensive, less than $3 per unit. Some were more. Obviously, a very crude measure, but it was dramatically higher scaling rate among the really cheap innovations. And I think that's something that we probably don't pay enough attention to when we think about what's likely to scale. Now, the second column deals with the scaling strategy. So some of these were designed to be sold direct to consumers, like those bicycle tires. Some of them were designed to be sold to companies or to governments, to be adopted by governments. What we saw was a much, much higher rate of scaling among the things that were designed to be adopted by existing large businesses or large NGOs or governments than things that were meant to be sold directly to consumers. And I think this is something, if we think about just normal investment, I think a lot of entrepreneurs think about selling to consumers, but obviously a lot of business is B2B or B2G. And this suggests that there might be a little bit of an arbitrage opportunity there. Why this difference in success rates? I think it comes back to, if you're going to scale in a low income context, if you're selling to the base of the pyramid, you really need a low cost product. But if it's a low cost product, then the customer acquisition costs are going to be prohibitive. Or I don't want to say prohibitive, there were successes, but they're a big challenge to overcome if you're trying to sell consumer by consumer by consumer. You really want, it's much easier if you can sell to a large established business, or you can sell to a government, or get adoption by a government. So the third result might be tied to that or might not. I think there's been we had a very evidence-based approach, and there's some debate over that. Some people think you need to be nimble, and getting evidence and doing RCTs sort of slows you down. You'll see that there was a much higher rate of scaling among things that had RCTs before, even before they applied to us, than among things that didn't. I should note that some of the successes that are in that red column didn't have an RCT before they came to us, but then did one afterwards. And so to some extent, they're a bit the exception that seems to prove the rule. Why are the RCTs useful? Well, one possibility is if you're selling to an individual consumer, they're not going to look up the RCT and look at the p-values on that. But if you're selling to, if you want adoption by a large insurance company, they may want to look at the evidence. Or if you want adoption by a government, they may care about the evidence. That's one hypothesis. So we don't know why RCTs are so predictive of success. Another possibility is if we think about other sectors, about biotech or about ICT, we don't think it's strange that researchers would be adding value to the innovation process. And I think it's possible that modern development economics with the experimental method has now reached that stage. And this process of trying things out, formally looking at the impact, modifying the innovation, and continuous iteration and bringing in ideas from elsewhere is actually useful. And you'll see that having an economics researcher also seems to be correlated with success. It's very collinear with RCTs, so we can't really separate those out. Okay, so let me suggest, and this is obviously going to be very speculative, a sketch of a model that might explain the results. And I think it points to a somewhat different way about thinking about the relationship between commercial investment and social investment, socially motivated investment. So the idea is that innovators have some sense, they know their innovation better than anybody else. They know something about the potential private returns, the potential obstacles, same thing for social returns. The investors, they try to do their best, but they don't have as much information. And perhaps they can invest in information acquisition, but they don't know as much. I think there are a lot of investors out there seeking commercial opportunities. And there are not just a lot of investors seeking that, but there are many. They're skilled, they're motivated, they've got incentives, they're well paid. Public sector investors, they're operating. They can make grants, which is an advantage, but they also have to account for their funds. They have to be publicly accountable. They have longer application procedures, so they may be less nimble. And that creates a risk that public sector investors might suffer from a winner's curse, that the things that are actually privately profitable attract private investment quickly, and then the risk is that the public sector sort of faces the leftovers and maybe has adverse selection. I certainly don't want to claim that that's inevitable. In fact, the track record here on social innovation is excellent that I've just showed. So how do you overcome that? What's the theory for how you do that? Well, let me suggest the following theory. That while the commercial investors are very good at certain types of investment and are certainly going to seize opportunities where there are private returns, they may leave an arbitrage opportunity for a socially motivated investor, where in the cases where there's low private returns or low anticipated private returns and high social returns. Now, when would that be? Well, economic theory gives some suggestions to that. One is when there are low barriers to entry. If you're a private investor, one of the things you might want is you want to make sure that the firm you invest in, if it succeeds, will not face a bunch of competition immediately afterwards. What Warren Buffett calls a moat to protect against additional competition. Now, if you're a socially motivated investor, you have totally different incentives. If you spec a solar technology and then there's a bunch of imitators of other solar companies, and they start distributing their product, that's a win for you. Okay, if we think about the characteristics that where we found high returns or high chance of scaling, one of them was having researcher involvement, RCTs. Those are something that might help the social return, but from a private point of view, it's not necessarily clear that you want a lot of public information in there on describing the innovation. Because maybe it makes it easier for others to come in. The second thing that comes out of the theory of technological change in economics is that some innovations are only useful when there's combined with an existing proprietary complementary asset. That means that that's less attractive for somebody to invest in from a private return point of view, because they're going to have to share the returns. They develop their innovation, but their innovation is only useful to one company. And that means that they're going to have to bargain over the price, and they're going to have to share the returns with that company, or possibly that government, or whatever it is. In this case, one of the things we found was most likely to generate social returns was when they, and to scale, was when they partnered with somebody else who had an existing distribution network, so they didn't need to undergo those cover those customer acquisition costs, whether that was an insurance company or a government, for example, in the case of the stickers to promote driver safety in minibuses. They didn't make a big private return off that program, but it generated a substantial social return. I think that's another general category where might be high social returns but low private returns. Another example would be when the consumer doesn't get the full value of the product. So a product to fight infectious disease like water treatment or perhaps COVID treatments. So here's a way to think about this graphically. There's some innovations that are going to be both privately and socially valuable, like ride-hailing apps. Ride-hailing apps, I think, are, you could argue about it, but I think they're clearly, you could argue both about the private and social value of it, but I think they're going to be both privately profitable and socially valuable. But the private sector is going to do that, and there are plenty of investors coming to do that. Another area is, if you sort of move to counterclockwise, area E, there are things that are privately profitable but not socially valuable. Alcohol, cigarettes, we probably don't want social investors to invest there. Then there are some things that are neither privately profitable nor socially valuable, like the play pumps example. You could argue about one laptop per child, but I'll stick my neck out there. Okay. If an innovator comes and says this is going to be, play pumps was supposed to be both privately, they were going to sell advertising, this was going to be commercially viable as well. But maybe we should have learned something from the fact that the commercial investors didn't go there. So what are the things where the commercial investors might not go or might not go fully, but there might be a role for social investors? Well, that would include some things that are socially valuable, but might never be commercially valuable, like voter technologies to reduce voting fraud, or possibly the water treatment dispensers. But there are other things where maybe the commercial investors wouldn't have come on their own, but once it's developed, once the R&D costs are paid, once the risks once it's de-risked, it might be privately profitable. I think this software for community health workers might be an example like that. So those, I would say, the red area is the area that may be a neglected area in social innovation and may have particularly high returns. Okay, why don't I note one other issue. So aside from where you should invest, there may be implications for how you structure the social innovation fund. And I think here's something where I feel like there may be some complementarity with the private sector. There are certain institutions that venture capital, certain ways of working that venture capital funds adopt that I assume do make a lot of sense for venture capital funds. But for social investor, they may want somewhat different procedures. So for example, feedback for rejected applicants. It's not clear why you would do that as a commercial venture capital fund. But if you're trying to, I think one of the more important services that DIV has provided is providing feedback to applicants who are rejected, who can try to improve their innovation. When we get, particularly from peer review, we do pretty extensive external peer review. If you're a venture capitalist, you do some peer review, but you have to be careful not to just give the idea to a competitor. Having researcher involvement, again, that's something that could hurt private returns by leading to competitors, but from a social point of view, makes sense. Support for early stage innovations. Again, there's less of a moat, less of a private advantage at the early stages, but the social return may be high. I would also say openness across sectors. If you're a commercial funder competing with many other VCs, if you're the top VC, maybe you can be open. But if you're not the top one, then you have to worry, are we only getting the leftovers from other VCs? Well, you combat that problem by getting real skill in a particular sector, getting staff who really know that sector. That may be less necessary and it may be possible for social investors to take a much more open approach, as long as, particularly if they complement with this sort of tiered evidence-based approach. Okay, let me just conclude and would love to get comments and discussion. First, the skewed distribution of innovation, echoing Amanda's point, a few innovations account for the bulk of the returns. So you really want to take a portfolio approach, and you need a decent sized portfolio to really be confident in the results. I think ideally we'd combine the results from many different portfolios. This DIV example suggests that there's at least the potential for very high returns. Having a 17-to-1 ratio of the benefits of a subset of the innovations to the cost of the full portfolio is, that's an amazing return. What things are most likely to scale? Well, low unit costs, pre-existing distribution network. None of these things are absolute, but it looks like previous RCT or researcher involvement is helpful as well. I think it would be great if other programs or funders could do similar exercises. I hope that our methodology can be useful. Happy to talk to others who are interested in this, and would love to get people's reactions and feedback as we continue to improve the analysis. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thanks very much for this really insightful presentation. I think the portfolio approach that the paper and this presentation showcase, I think really do helpfully shift this conversation from the over-reliance that we often see on anecdotes of successes or even failures, depending on the point someone is trying to make, to really measuring like the social rate of return for the entire portfolio. And I think in doing so that, Michael and co-authors also advance the case, for donors and other social investors to really think about how they can increase investment in development innovation in this way. I also think that this makes the case for two other things. So one is a greater focus on thinking about per dollar results. And the other is thinking about patience when you're thinking about results. I mean, it was very clear, I think, in this presentation about the amount of time that it takes to scale some of these interventions. And, admittedly, patience for results isn't always, what bureaucracies excel at or are really known for. But I think the work that Michael presented here, along with his co-authors, really becomes an important input into this kind of conversation.